Hi, I'm Duncan Moss, and I'd like to welcome you to my latest video blog. Some 6 weeks ago, I did a feature on my friendship with the actress Heather Sears. I'm now going to do one on her husband, art director and production designer Tony Masters, with an emphasis on him as our next door neighbour and friend for life, really. Tony saw action in the Second World War in the artillery, following in the footsteps of his father, Percival Masters, who was in the artillery in the First World War. In 1949, Tony worked as a draftsman on his first film, which I think was called The Hasty Heart. And he worked steadily through the 1950s as a draftsman and set dresser. He was a draftsman, I think, on the Alfred Hitchcock film Stage Fright with Alistair Sim in 1950, and a set dresser on the 1957 film A King in New York, which starred Charlie Chaplin. I don't know whether the two great men actually met. I'd like to think they did. Perhaps either Adam Giles or Dominic Tony's and Heather's sons could help me on that one. In 1957, Tony was art director on a film called The Story of Esther Costello, and that's where he met his future wife, Heather Sears. The film also starred Joan Crawford, and Heather played a deaf, dumb, and blind young girl. The film also featured Sid James in a straight role, and both Tony and Heather said lovely things about Sid James. Said what a great guy he was to work with, and. Tony worked as an art director on a number of films. The Corridors of Blood with Boris Karloff, and I asked him what Boris Karloff was like to work with, and Tony said he was lovely. And Boris umpired a cricket match, which they played. A lot of people from the film played in the evenings. They would play cricket, and Boris, who used to play cricket, but by that time I think his legs were not good, so he would umpire. Tony was also art director on Espresso Bongo with Cliff Richard. He was also worked for Disney on the Moon Spinners, Disney Studios in Burbank, California, where he actually met Walt Disney. I think that film had Hayley Mills in it. He also then worked on Ferry Across the Mersey, which was a Brian Epstein feature starring Jerry Marston and Cilla Black. And I think it was produced by Tony's brother-in-law. That was Mike Holden, who Adam Giles and Dominic's Uncle Mike, who I met just once, but he was a very interesting man. I think he produced the film along with Brian Epstein. And Tony would then sometimes be a production designer, and on some films. And he was a production designer on 2001: A Space Odyssey, for which he won a British award, and I think he was nominated for an Oscar, which he didn't get, I don't think, but he worked on other science fiction films, one of them being the 1963 The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which he worked with for Hammer with Brian Johnson, and they only had a budget of £30,000 to do the special effects, and they did very, very well. And the film's very, very low budget, but if you haven't seen it, it's 1961, The Day the Earth Caught Fire. It is a fabulously exciting British science fiction thriller, and I think you can get it easily. But But I think it was really the 2001 A Space Odyssey that I think that just went and sent Tony up into the highest notch. Now, as a neighbour, he was a very nice man. I went to several of Adam Giles and Dominic's cowboy and Indian parties where they would hire a donkey, and Tony would lead the donkey around the garden with children on the donkey's back. Because at the time, we were all very much into kiddie westerns like Casey Jones and Range Rider. And that was a very nice part of my childhood, going around there and playing with their toys, or they came round and played with us. And we usually didn't go through the front door, as I said before. We just jumped over the fence. And we all went to the same schools, which was my brother and myself and the boys, Grantchester House, first, and then Shrewsbury House. Grantchester House used to put on, which was really 4 till 8. We used to put on nativity plays, and Tony designed I believe the set for the Bethlehem set, which comprised of a stable and adjacent buildings, and they used to keep the scenery around in their garage with their Rolls Royce and 2 Bentleys, and it would be brought out and sent round to St Christopher's Church for every year for as long as I can remember. Even when we'd left the school, it was still being used. It was a beautiful set. Tony had obviously done his homework very much on Palestine 2,000 years ago. He would drive us sometimes to school, and he was always with something very interesting to tell us. Sometimes you didn't want the journey to stop because he didn't smoke like Heather. So we didn't have Jatane cigarettes to take on. And sometimes we just wished he could go around the block a bit and tell us a bit more about the story. As I say, he was pretty laid back. Very rarely did he get angry, and if he did, it was for a good reason. I think I was a bit cheeky once, and I got. He told me off, and quite right too. I remember we had a young lad, Stefan, joined their family as a house. His mother Gita was a housekeeper, and Stefan was her son, and they lived with the Masters lads when Adam Giles and Don, when Heather and Tony were both away, and. We were watching The Greatest Story Ever Told on TV, and Stefan saw David McCallum and said, "Oh, that's the guy from Colditz, isn't it?" And Giles went, "Oh, clever, aren't you?" And Tony just looked straight at Giles and said, "Giles, are you trying to be unpleasant? Because if you are, I'm not going to tolerate it." He always reminded me of a sheriff in a Western, and Tony worked on a Western, Buffalo Bill and the Indians, as an art director, and because he was so tall, the director said, "Oh, you're our band leader on the parade." And Tony said, "But I don't know anything about leading parades or twirling batons and everything." And the director said, "No, don't worry, you'll be trained." So Tony led the parade in the film Buffalo Bill and the Indians, and. Tony was around. He'd just come back from working on the Deep when I made my film The Zombie Cometh around at the Masters households, and he was and Heather very kindly postponed a shopping trip because we were a bit behind schedule, just finishing the picture off, which was very kind of them. And I did get into the film industry and the admin side, but I had hoped to be a film director, and I'd gone to a college for an interview, and I told them like I was no good at drawing, and they said, "Well, you can't be a film director if you can't draw," because And I thought, well, that can't be right. And I went home, and Tony happened to be in the country at the time. And I phoned him up and I said, is this true that you can't be a director if you can't draw? And he said, Duncan, I've never heard that at all. He said, the vast majority of directors can't draw at all. So the people at this college don't know what they're talking about. And I know some directors can draw really well. Ridley Scott can, and so did Alfred Hitchcock and Sergei Eisenstein. But I was told by other people that just because you can't draw storyboards doesn't mean you can't be a director. And so I felt very happy about that, because I really was at a very, very low ebb. And Tony at that time was preparing to work on Dune, and he was telling us all about what they were looking at for locations and things. And Dune was made. I went to see it at Isha Cinema. I quite enjoyed it. I had a little bit of difficulty understanding what was going on. I hadn't read the book, and the film had been very slated by the critics. And sadly, it didn't do very well at the box office. And I said, when I went round to Adam Giles and Dom's, and Tony was there, and I said to Tony, I said, I've seen Dune. And he smiled and said, well, I did my bit properly. And I found out from Tony that Jerry Anderson, the Thunderbirds fame, was British. I'd always thought he was American. So I was quite surprised at that. One time, Tony came and Heather came around for a drink at our new house when we moved. And my father had a lot of aircraft, big models of aircraft up in his study. And he was trying to open a bottle of champagne. And he said, oh, Tony, I'm having a bit of trouble with this. Can you see whether you can do it? So Tony had a go at it, and the cork popped up right up into the air and knocked one of the wings of one of my dad's Lancasters off. And they had a good laugh at it. And Tony said, well, I was in the artillery. I made a movie called Revenge of the Zombie, and I showed it to Heather and Tony. I had to show it on my editor, because I didn't have a projector at the time, and their projector, the bulb, I think, had gone. So I showed it to them on the editor, and I said, what do you think? Tony was quite nice about it. Said, it's good fun. And Heather just said, Duncan, I think it's the biggest load of drivel I've ever seen in my life. And I said, okay, because... she said, you've had some good ideas in the past, but I think this is just you trying to. She said it hasn't really worked, has it? And I said, I guess not, because it was originally supposed to be serious, and halfway through the production, it was going so badly, we turned it into a comedy. And I took it well, and I went home, and then a few hours later, and Heather went, "Oh, I've been so nasty to Duncan," but I didn't mind. I she didn't mean it unkindly, and sometimes it's good to hear these things. And as I say, Tony was a good friend. I would often ask him questions about working with famous people. He worked with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman on Papillon, just down the road from where it was being shot in, I think, Lagos, Nigeria. Paul McCartney and Wings were recording Band on the Run. I don't know whether Tony bumped into Paul. I know Dustin Hoffman did, because it inspired the song Picasso's Last Words. As I say, Tony was a very modest man. He didn't go on about how he met, who he'd worked with. You really had to prize it out of him, because he was not a name dropper by any stretch of the imagination. And when he was working on a film called Colossus, which he'd written a script for, and it was going to be Going production, Brian Johnson was going to do the special effects, and I think that Peter MacDonald was going to direct. And very sadly, here in May 1990, as they were getting in pre-production, Tony died of very suddenly playing tennis in France. That was a terrible, terrible shock to everyone. Obviously, to his family, not to his family more than anything else. But Tony's wonderful movies go on and are shown, and I try to see some of them that I haven't seen before. I saw the last one I saw, I think in the cinema, was Clan of the Cave Bear, which is a very, very with Daryl Hannah. It was a very sensible prehistoric drama. That was very good. He worked on the Heroes of Telemark, the Deep, just a lot of very quality films. There is a quite fun story because Tony's contract on 2001: A Space Odyssey came to an end, and Stanley Kubrick said, "Oh, but Tony, you haven't designed me a landing pad yet for the moon base." So Tony took a memo pad and drew one on the memo pad and handed it to Stanley and said, "No, sorry, Stanley, my contract's up. I've got to go. I've got another film to work on." And that was The Adventurers. And Stanley Kubrick got, I think, two other production designers to finish off the movie. But Tony designed all of that wonderful French, it's 18th century palace where Dave Bowman ends up at the end of the film, and so he had 20 people working under him on 2001, and as I say, there was a famous bedspread in that film that Tony took home with him, and spent its last time appearing in a couple of movies. But yeah, I can't believe it was 1990 that Tony passed away. He was just a very good friend. I always treasure the memories of him and Heather. And as I say, I'm always proud to see Adam Giles and Dom's name coming up on anything. I hope I haven't waffled too much, and I hope sharing these little stories with you you've enjoyed them. Thank you very much. Goodbye.